I grew up in northwest London at the far end of the Jubilee line, right at the far end.
And were your family political in any way, and how did that influence you?
Well, my great-grandparents were immigrants who had come over from Belarus from the pogroms when they were very young. My great-grandmother was 15 and my great-grandfather was 16, and they met on the boat coming over. They were staunch, they lived in the Pale of Settlements, and they were very, very strong Bolsheviks and then became Mensheviks. And when they were over here in the East End of London, my great-grandfather was part of the cabinet makers trade unionists. So that sense of coming from that kind of Jewish immigrant background with a very strong kind of communist lean and very strong workers' rights was sort of ingrained in me. Later on, I think, as often happens, I think my family became my dad was like a liberal, I think. So politics was very much a part of the dinner table conversations. And as with most, I think, immigrant families, sitting around with big family meals, particularly every Friday night, always talk about politics and global affairs.
As you say, you grew up in a Jewish household. Were your family religious?
They were very aware of their identity. I would say that they were, there's different, that's a funny thing about being Jewish. There are lots of different sorts of identities. So I would say they were observant. We kept Friday night dinners. We kept all the major festivals. And again, that feeling of, particularly with my parents' generation, they were one step less religious than the parents that went before them, but their identity was very, so I was very aware of all the kind of rules and regulations and things that you should do. And their attitude was, if you've been educated to know what it means, you can then reject that later on, but at least have the knowledge.
And so when did you first join the Labour Party?
I just, when I was at university in Leeds, and I think I was there in 1984, 85, and was it 84? Yes, it was about 84, 85. And then I moved over to Manchester. But when I was in Leeds, particularly in those mid-80s, it was in the height of the miners' strike, the height of the recession, height of Thatcherism. And having come from sort of North London, where it was like living in a bubble, I went up to Leeds and I saw genuine deprivation and genuinely the things I was seeing on the news and what I was understanding, about unfairness and privilege and all of that was suddenly very apparent to me. So I was very much a part of the Labour Party then. And then I moved over I went to Manchester University. I moved after a year. I was doing classics and I moved to Manchester to do drama and literature, and I was very much a part of kind of student Labour then.
And you talked just briefly about your background and how your kind of ancestors came from Belarus. You may be looking in the news right now about what's going on there. What's your feeling about what's happening in worldwide politics, not just domestic?
Yeah, it's really funny, being an actor and a writer, that's my kind of working identity. And I'm very much early on as an actor, I'm going to reclaim the word actress. I'm actually going to reclaim that word. As an actress, one's politics were, you kept your politics and your religion and your opinions out of any equation. Particularly when I was starting out, it was sort of seen as particularly Anne as a woman, you were very much seen as trying not to have opinions, just do your work. That every job I've ever done has always informed my politics, because everything we do is political, isn't it? And everything we experience is political with a small p. When I was doing Fiddler on the Roof down in Chichester, it was the first musical I'd been asked to do, and the director, Daniel Evans, was very much treating this musical, but as a sort of political piece of theatre, because it was about immigration, it was about ripping families out of their homes and scattering them to the four winds and breaking up communities and traditions and families, and it really resonated. And because of that, I felt very strongly that I didn't want that musical just to be, you know, music and a pogrom, another nice song and a bit more of a pogrom. I really wanted to inform that musical with a genuine history that was my great-grandmother's and great-grandfather's history. You know, my great-grandmother used to watch Fiddler on the Roof and basically say that's a documentary. So I went back into the family annals and spoke to surviving members about that history. And I found out about in Belarus, in the Pale of Settlements, where the Jews were forced to live, very, very poor, no ownership at all. They were literally dirt poor, no education, essentially peasants. And they were sort of ghettoized. Within that, the women, the younger women and the young men were very, very political. And because Tsar Nicholas was a huge anti-Semite and put out the untruth that a Jewish person had tried to assassinate him, he used to pay his Cossacks, who were the sort of dominant society around Belarus. They used to pay them in alcohol, and then they would send them off to do these terrible pogroms. And I found out that my great-grandmother, when she was very young, was nearly raped on one of these Cossack raids. She nearly saw her father beheaded. They used to come into these villages. They would grab the boys from 8, 9, 10, 11, put them in the Russian army. When you were poor like that, the only thing you had for your dowry were the feathers from the chickens that they would put into their duvets, their eiderdowns and their pillows, and that was your dowry. The Cossacks used to come in and slash them to shreds. You know, all these incredible details that had been passed down. Similarly, my great-grandfather was very politically active with workers' rights in the village next door, and had to flee Belarus because of his political activism. So yes, seeing what's going on at the moment it never ceases to amaze me how cyclical politics are, you know?
And do you think that from that we should be educating more about that? I mean, you're educating me this morning, Tracy, on some of that history and some of that past. Do we do enough of that in our schools?
Well, I'm absolutely passionate. Yeah, I mean, I've got a theatre project that was meant to be on at the moment, which was basically a version of The Merchant of Venice with me as a female Shylock, based in Cable Street in the East End of London. With Oswald Mosley as Antonio and the Mitford girls as the Portias. And we were taking that around 5 different regional theatres and then coming into London with the aim of the theatre project standing alone, but within that, telling each of these regional areas the story of their own brush with fascism. For people who don't know, Cable Street was our own civil rights moment, where Oswald Mosley decided to run on the anti-Jewish working class ticket, and he took his thugs, hundreds and thousands of them, protected on horseback through the streets of Cable Street in the East End, through the slums, and he wanted to incite violence against the Jewish influence, the international influence. And he tried to cause dissent amongst all the working class communities by basically telling the Irish and the Black communities there and the indigenous British working class, English working class, that the Jews were getting the best stalls in Watling Street and the Jews were getting the better houses. But what happened, and I know this verbatim because my grandmother was a little girl, but she stood and said, "You shall not pass," as did my great uncle Alf. He was 14. They all stood, and every single working class community came and stood with them. And Cable Street is legendary because it was when all the dockers and all the working class communities stood up against middle class, upper middle class white fascism and a leader, Oswald Mosley, who could have been the leader of the Labour Party. They threw marbles from the streets, they formed lines, they said, "You shan't pass," they turned over milk floats. They stopped them from coming through. And my great uncle Alf always said he remembers standing in between 14 dockers, the local milkman, my grandmother was there, my little uncle Leslie, that was throwing marbles from the window with all the women to stop them from being able to walk down the street. My great uncle Alf was thrown through the big plate glass window, the big shopping. There was one big shopping centre on the corner, a big shop, and he was thrown through that plate glass window. You know, this was a civil rights moment, and Mosley and his thugs had to turn back. That is not known by I was shocked by the fact that so few people really know about Cable Street. So for me, doing that piece of theatre was about educating and trying to get into schools and trying to work with local communities about their history of communities pulling together. So I'm glad you say that I'm educating you, because I'm passionate that these moments of our history have to be reclaimed and have to be remembered.
As you say, they can become very cyclical otherwise. Going back to present day, how do you think Keir Starmer is doing as the leader of the Labour Party?
I think he's got a real problem on his hands. Keir, he's got a real problem on his hands for the years that, Jeremy Corbyn bought and attracted a lot of people that I think Keir would rather distance himself from. Jeremy bought into the main house vernacular thoughts, feelings that were very, very far out of the mainstream. And he brought some really unpleasant elements, I would say, into the main house and into the main conversation. People that I knew from university as socialist workers, revolutionary communists, this concept of Antifa, people where the word centrist and moderation is seen as akin to being a Nazi, so I think Keir is left wing, but I think he's got a problem trying to unite his party, and there's going to be a lot of undermining for him.
I mean, you turned your back on the party when it failed to revoke Ken Livingstone's membership. Why was that moment the turning point for you?
What crossed the line for me was when Ken felt so emboldened that he was able to say on a radio station that, quote, Hitler had been a Zionist until he went mad and murdered 6 million of them. Well, as somebody whose family was murdered when Hitler went mad, I found that offensive. I think to turn around and say that Hitler had been a Zionist until he went mad was like saying, oh, well, the British National Party or the National Front were really pro-black people, but that, it's like them offering, saying, oh, I would pay for your airfare home, go back to your own country. Hitler wasn't a Zionist. He didn't believe in, he just wanted the Jews either dead or out, and he just wanted to get a lot of money from them. And Jews were in no position to, anyway, I'm not even having to justify that. The point was that was an absolutely appalling slur that anti-Semites have said for many years, and anti-Zionists have said, and taken out of historical context and with no nuance or understanding. Much of the problem with the Labour Party under Jeremy, no nuance, no historical understanding. And the Labour Party refused, well, because he was one of Jeremy's key allies and old friends. They wouldn't act on it. When you have Margaret Hodge being disciplined within 4.5 hours and Alistair Campbell being chucked out within 12 hours, you cannot have one of your main allies saying something as offensive as Hitler was a Zionist until he went mad and murdered 6 million of them. I mean, you know.
And you've talked about Keir Starmer's problem trying to unite two sides of the party.
Well, I was very disappointed in Keir at the time, because I felt that I'd met Keir, I'd flagged up my worries, and I can see it was very difficult. But at the time, there was so much, when it's difficult for me to talk about this because it's upsetting and it feels disloyal to the party that I felt very strongly about. Also, it incites massive hatred and pile-ons on social media, as you know. It was very unfashionable to say, oh, I've got reservations about this, because people projected onto him all that they hoped and wished. He became a projection. People on the whole didn't know a lot about him, but for those of us that had been following Jeremy for many years, knew that there was a lot of very worrying elements, Holocaust deniers, inviting Holocaust deniers and terrorists as trusted friends in fatigue on the ballot. There was just a lot to be worried about. Yeah. I think it was very difficult for Keir at the time. He was on the front bench, and I guess he was playing a political long game. But for those of us on the outside who were desperate for grown-ups like Keir to speak out and to condemn, a lot of what was going on. You know, the bullying of Luciana Berger, the bullying of Joan Ryan, of Louise Ellman, of Margaret Hodge. You know, there were some disgusting things that were going on. The fact that it took somebody like myself or Rachel Riley or David Baddiel to actually speak out about the problems that were going on in Labour with women and Jews, to bring it into the public forum. Nobody spoke out.
Do you think the women have been braver in this scenario, Tracy?
In some ways, yes, I do. I mean, you know, there's a Jewish story of Esther, the Jewish girl who was married to the king. It's our festival of Purim. You can look it up. Esther was the leader who sort of saved her nation. And I think that the Jewish tradition has always been about strong matriarchs leading from the front. I think the women have been very brave. And if you look at social media, which was the weapon, the sort of battle zone that I ended up on, because that's what Twitter and social media is now. It's basically a fake war battleground. Because it drives news, and what's trending and what inflates on Twitter, sadly, drives news and opinions. So I ended up I felt I had to stay on there to puncture conversations and beliefs that all Jews were rich Zios, that the BBC was run by a Zio cabal, that anybody that spoke out on anti-Semitism was being paid by the Israeli. You know, these are all things that I've been told, that we deserve to die, that... But I think what people did underestimate was that they think that women get frightened very quickly and intimidated. And I think the brilliant thing is they don't do it to men, because I think they're scared of men on men battles. But I think they thought that when they attack the women, most women just want to be decorative and quiet and passive. But they picked the wrong people, because we didn't. On the contrary, every time I would get more and more aggression thrown my way for pointing out what I was my living experience of horrible misogyny and anti-Semitism. I would get these organized pile-ons, which came from, I would assume, within elements of parts of Labour. You know, thousands and thousands of people saying terrible things to me, spreading around lies and libel. But they thought I'd go away and be frightened, and I wouldn't.
You've got to be pretty strong to be able to deal with that. How do you react to Twitter trolls? Do you think there should be a clampdown?
Well, look, you know, as an actor over the age of 40, as an actress over the age of 40, as I've always said, I used to say this to Lorraine Kelly, who was a brilliant ally on this. You know, if you've been in the media for over 25 years and you're a woman, you grow some pretty thick skin. So it didn't, you know, really didn't impact. But what did impact is when you get thousands of them trying to get you fired from your job, when you find out that you're on a Jew list. This has made me stick my head above the parapet, really work out what I stand for, and really work out what I'm prepared to, you know, which is the hill that I'm prepared to really die on. And this is one of them. I think the thing that informed my politics mostly was when I was 4 years old, in a moment of crazy parenting, my parents took me on a day trip to the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. And my dad went into the Hall of Names to see if he could find members of the family and wanted to have it verified that they died in the concentration camps. And I was pretty much left to wander on my own. And I saw such terrible images that I couldn't really understand. I mean, I was far too young. It was deeply traumatic, but also it really informed who I was. You know, I saw these pictures of bodies, female body. There was one image of a female body being put into an oven to be incinerated. There was a pile of children's shoes, there was hair, skeletal bodies, mounds of, you know, terrible, terrible things. And I sort of knew that this had something to do with being Jewish and being other. And it really taught me at such a young age that this is the end game, the terrible, terrible end game of othering other people. And one of the things that myself and a lot of my peers who also were brought up with the kind of Holocaust obsession was, if we had been there at the time and if people were doing that to other people, would we stand up? Would we stand up? How did the world let this happen? How did our people let this happen? And I had one great uncle, Joseph, who did survive the Warsaw Ghetto and 2 concentration camps. And I was very close to him, and he lived in France, but I remember speaking to him in broken French, you know, asking how it could happen. And he said, because people look the other way. And I couldn't be one of the people that looked the other way. And that is what I found so upsetting on social media, when at the time Labour politicians looked as if they were looking the other way.
You talked about Keir Starmer having some issues trying to unite the party. What chances do you think they might have of taking over an 80-seat majority that held by Boris Johnson and winning the next election?
I mean, you know, this is the other thing. Myself and Rachel Riley basically are told constantly by people on Twitter that we lost the election for Jeremy Corbyn, that we personally managed to sway the entire red wall from voting against Corbyn. I mean, it's just, I mean, I'm impressed that I have that level of power, but I mean, it's just a nonsense. Labour has, you know, every single person that ignored the signs and couldn't work out why Corbyn was such an anathema to the voting public for many reasons, really needs to look into their heart and work out whether they wanted a Labour victory, or whether it was just, you know, identity politics and you know, it sways me. I think the good thing with Keir is that he's the absolute antithesis to Jeremy. I think he's a very calm, legal brain. He doesn't, you know, he's very forensic in his analysis. It won't appeal to people that want to follow one, you know, a cult. I'm not going to say the word cult, but, you know, if you want to have a leader that you can project onto and who you can, you know, you feel is like your personal relation, and who can whip up this sense of almost godlike devotion, that won't be Keir. But for people who would like to feel that there is a grown-up, as it were, trying very hard to appeal to a wide range, a broad church, I think Keir stands a good chance. I hope so.
Just looking at lockdown, what lockdown was like for you, COVID and the arts, do you think the government are doing enough to help the arts, which have been so badly affected by the coronavirus crisis?
Well, I mean, I think personally the government's handling of the coronavirus speaks for itself. Probably not, but I understand that the arts have never been seen as that important in our country. You know, it's nice, but it's never really seen as a viable business. But, you know, to talk economics to the Tories, the arts is more, you know, is a business. I was quite vocal on this, trying to get Rishi Sunak to understand that this wasn't a bailout for the arts, it was an investment into the arts, because it pays itself, it washes its own face and then some, because the arts make a fortune.
In about 20 seconds or less, because I do have to wrap up, and I'm really grateful for your time. How have you spent lockdown?
I've spent lockdown writing a radio play for Radio 4, which is going to be recorded quite soon, about the making of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, against the backdrop of the 1967 race riots in LA. Which proved to be very timely. I've done a series called Done Breeding with a group of actress girlfriends online, which did very well. I have been doing loads and loads of podcasts. I've become a fantastic chef. I've actually spent more time with my dog, cat, husband and daughter than I think I ever have done. And I valued the simple things in life.
I like the order of priority there. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.